My name is Andrew, and today I'm going to tell you about the night God shattered my illusion of control with words that forced me to confront the exhausting reality of trying to manage everything and everyone around me. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if this story speaks to your heart. Share it with someone you love who might be struggling with the need to control outcomes. And please leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with learning to surrender control to God. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October 2023, and I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by color-coded spreadsheets, detailed project timelines, and 3 different notebooks filled with contingency plans for every possible scenario I could imagine. At 34 years old, I had built what looked like a perfectly controlled life, a successful consulting business, a beautiful home, investments carefully diversified across multiple portfolios, and backup plans for my backup plans. But that night, as I sat staring at my latest attempt to orchestrate the perfect outcome for a client project, I felt something I had been fighting my entire adult life. The terrifying realization that despite all my planning, preparation, and micromanagement, I couldn't actually control anything that truly mattered. The project that had me working past midnight was supposed to be straightforward, helping a mid-sized manufacturing company streamline their operations to increase efficiency and profitability. I had spent 6 months developing what I believed was a flawless implementation plan, accounting for every variable I could identify, creating detailed timelines with built-in buffers, and establishing backup protocols for potential complications. Everything had been going according to my meticulously crafted schedule until that morning, when the company's CEO called with news that sent my carefully controlled world into chaos. "Andrew, I need to let you know that we're being acquired by a larger corporation. The deal should close in 60 days, and they'll want to review all current projects, including yours." The moment I hung up the phone, my mind went into overdrive, trying to regain control of a situation that was spinning beyond my influence. What if the new owners cancel the project? What if 6 months of work becomes worthless? What if they bring in their own consultants? What if this damages my reputation with other clients? What if I can't recover the revenue I was counting on? What if this affects my ability to make my mortgage payments? What if my entire business model is more fragile than I thought? I had spent the entire day trying to create new plans to address this unexpected development. I researched the acquiring company, analyzed their previous merger patterns, developed multiple scenarios for how the transition might unfold, and created action plans for each possibility. But no amount of planning could change the fundamental reality. This situation was completely outside my control. As I sat at my kitchen table that night, reviewing my latest batch of contingency plans, I felt the weight of a lifetime spent trying to control outcomes that were never mine to control. The spreadsheets and timelines that usually brought me comfort now felt like monuments to my own futility. Despite all my efforts to plan, prepare, and manage every detail, I was still at the mercy of decisions made by people I'd never met, market forces I couldn't predict, and circumstances I couldn't influence. The truth I had been avoiding my entire adult life was staring me in the face. I was not in control. Not of my business, not of my clients' decisions, not of market conditions, not of other people's choices, not even of my own future. The elaborate systems I had built to create the illusion of control were just that, illusions. I thought about my childhood, growing up in a home where my father's alcoholism created constant chaos and unpredictability. I remembered making a promise to myself at 12 years old that when I grew up, I would never let circumstances control my life the way they controlled our family. I would plan everything, prepare for every possibility, and never be caught off guard by situations I couldn't handle. That childhood vow had shaped every major decision I'd made as an adult. I chose a career where I could be my own boss because I couldn't stand the idea of my income depending on someone else's decisions. I bought a house I could afford on my own because I didn't want to rely on anyone else's financial stability. I maintained emergency funds that could cover 2 years of expenses because I needed to know I could survive any economic downturn. But sitting there that night, surrounded by the evidence of my compulsive need to control every outcome, I realized that my quest for security had become a prison. The energy I spent trying to manage every variable in my life was exhausting. The constant planning for worst-case scenarios was robbing me of joy in the present. The inability to rest, unless everything was perfectly organized, was destroying my peace. God, I whispered into the silence of my kitchen, I'm so tired of trying to control everything. I'm exhausted from planning for every possibility. I can't keep living like this, but I don't know how to let go. I'm scared that if I stop trying to manage everything, my life will fall apart. The words came out broken, desperate, like a confession from someone who had finally admitted the futility of a battle he'd been fighting alone for decades. I wasn't even sure I believed God would answer. Faith had always felt like another variable I couldn't control, another area where outcomes depended on factors beyond my influence. What happened next changed everything about how I understood control, surrender, and the difference between managing my responsibilities and trying to manage the universe. In the quiet that followed my desperate prayer, I heard something that wasn't quite an audible voice, but was clearer than any sound I'd ever experienced. Deep in my spirit, cutting through the noise of my racing plans and contingency scenarios, came these words, "Andrew, you try to control, but only I take care of everything." The peace that washed over me was immediate and profound. It wasn't that my circumstances suddenly became more manageable. The client acquisition was still happening, the project outcome was still uncertain, and my business was still facing potential disruption. But for the first time in my adult life, I experienced what it felt like to not carry the weight of trying to control outcomes that were never mine to control. The phrase, "only I take care of everything," hit me with particular force. God wasn't criticizing my efforts to be responsible or prepared. He was revealing the fundamental difference between doing my part and trying to do His part. I could plan, work diligently, and make wise decisions, but the ultimate outcomes, the things that really determined whether my efforts succeeded or failed, were in hands much more capable than mine. I sat there for hours, just absorbing this new understanding. The spreadsheets were still on my table, but they no longer felt like life or death necessities. The contingency plans were still there, but they no longer carried the weight of my entire sense of security. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe deeply without the constant tension of trying to manage every variable in my environment. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in months. Not because my circumstances had changed, but because I had discovered something more reliable than my own ability to control outcomes. I had found someone who actually could take care of everything, not just the things I could see and plan for, but all the variables I couldn't even identify, all the possibilities I couldn't imagine, all the factors that lay completely outside my sphere of influence. When I woke up the next morning, the client situation was exactly the same, but my relationship to it had been transformed. Instead of waking up to anxiety about all the things I couldn't control, I woke up to curiosity about how God would take care of things I couldn't manage myself. This was the beginning of the most liberating journey of my life, learning to distinguish between my responsibilities and God's, between faithful preparation and obsessive control, between wise planning and anxious micromanagement. Over the weeks and months that followed, I would discover what it really means to work diligently while resting in God's care, and how surrendering control actually leads to greater peace and effectiveness than trying to manage everything myself. If you're reading this and feeling exhausted by the burden of trying to control outcomes in your life, if you're lying awake at night, planning for every possible scenario, If you're discovering that no amount of preparation can guarantee the results you want, I want you to know that there is another way. God sees your efforts, He values your diligence, but He doesn't want you to carry the weight of trying to manage outcomes that belong to Him. You can do your part faithfully while trusting Him to take care of everything else. The morning after God spoke to me brought a strange sensation I hadn't experienced in years. The feeling of waking up without immediately reaching for my phone to check if any overnight developments had disrupted my carefully laid plans. Instead, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and marveling at the absence of the familiar knot of anxiety that usually greeted me each morning. My first instinct was to jump out of bed and begin my normal routine of checking emails, reviewing my daily schedule, and mentally rehearsing contingency plans for potential problems. But something made me pause. Instead of launching into control mode, I found myself remembering God's words from the night before. You try to control, but only I take care of everything. And as I made coffee, I noticed how different my morning felt when I wasn't immediately trying to manage every aspect of the day ahead. Instead of my usual mental checklist of things to monitor, adjust, and control, I felt a curious sense of expectation. Not anxiety about what might go wrong, but genuine curiosity about how God would handle the things I couldn't. The real test came when I opened my laptop and saw 3 new emails from the client whose company was being acquired. My old self would have immediately panicked, assuming the messages contained bad news that would require immediate damage control. Instead, I found myself taking a deep breath and asking a question I'd never thought to ask before. God, you said you take care of everything. How do you want me to approach these emails? What emerged wasn't dramatic revelation, but a calmer, more grounded approach to reading the messages. Instead of bracing for disaster, I simply read them with openness to whatever information they contained. The first email was from the CEO, providing more details about the acquisition timeline. The second was from the operations manager, expressing concerns about how the transition might affect ongoing projects. The third was from the incoming company's project review team, requesting a meeting to discuss all current initiatives. My old response would have been to immediately begin crafting multiple strategic responses, developing elaborate presentations to protect my position, and creating backup plans for every possible decision they might make. Instead, I found myself simply responding honestly and professionally to each email, offering to provide whatever information they needed, and expressing my commitment to supporting the transition in whatever way would be most helpful. The difference in my approach was subtle but profound. Instead of trying to control their perception of me or manipulate the outcome in my favor, I simply focused on being truthful, helpful, and professional. Instead of assuming I needed to fight for my position, I trusted that if this project was meant to continue, God would handle that, and if it wasn't, He would provide other opportunities. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang with a call from my business mentor, Richard, who had been guiding my consulting practice for the past 5 years. Richard had built his own successful firm and had always impressed me with his ability to navigate difficult client situations with apparent ease. Andrew, I heard about the acquisition situation with your manufacturing client. How are you holding up? I found myself sharing about the previous night's experience with complete honesty. The exhaustion of trying to control everything, the desperate prayer, and God's response about taking care of everything I couldn't manage. Richard was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. Andrew, I've been waiting 3 years for you to learn that lesson. Watching you try to control every outcome has been painful because I could see how much energy you were wasting on things that were never yours to manage. What do you mean? I asked. Son, the most successful consultants I know aren't the ones who try to control their clients' decisions. They're the ones who do excellent work and trust that excellence will create the right opportunities. You've been so focused on trying to guarantee specific outcomes that you've been exhausting yourself with efforts that actually work against you. Richard's words hit me like a revelation. He continued, "Clients can sense when you're trying to manipulate or control their decisions, and it makes them less likely to trust you. But when they sense that you're focused on serving their best interests without attachment to specific outcomes, they're much more likely to value your input and continue working with you." We talked for another 30 minutes about the difference between taking responsibility for the quality of my work and trying to control the results of that work. By the end of the conversation, I had a completely different perspective on the client situation. That afternoon, I had the meeting with the acquiring company's project review team. Instead of approaching it as a presentation where I needed to sell them on continuing the project, I approached it as an information session where I could help them understand what had been accomplished and what options were available moving forward. "Gentlemen," I began, "I want to start by saying that my goal in this meeting is to give you complete transparency about this project so you can make the best decision for your company. Whether that means continuing with the current plan, modifying it, or discontinuing it entirely, I want to make sure you have all the information you need." The shift in energy was immediate. Instead of feeling defensive or suspicious, the team seemed to relax into a collaborative discussion about the project's merits and how it might or might not fit with their integration plans. For the next 2 hours, we had what felt like the most honest and productive client conversation I'd had in years. Instead of trying to steer them toward a particular conclusion, I simply answered their questions thoroughly and helped them think through the implications of various approaches. At the end of the meeting, the lead reviewer, a woman named Jennifer, made a comment that stunned me. "Andrew, this is refreshing. Usually when companies are being acquired, consultants spend the entire meeting trying to convince us why their projects should continue. You've actually helped us think through what would be best for our organization, regardless of how it affects you. That level of integrity is rare." Driving home from that meeting, I called my sister Rachel, who had been watching me struggle with control issues for years. When I described the day's events and the different approach I'd taken, her response was immediate. "Andrew, you sound like a completely different person. For years, I've watched you tie yourself in knots trying to manage outcomes you couldn't control. Today you sound peaceful, confident, and genuinely helpful instead of manipulative." "Manipulative?" I asked, surprised by her word choice. "I don't mean intentionally manipulative," she clarified, "but when you're constantly trying to control outcomes, even with good intentions, it comes across as self-serving rather than other-serving. Today, it sounds like you were actually focused on what was best for them, not on what you could get from them." Her observation helped me realize that my need to control hadn't just been exhausting for me, it had also been limiting my effectiveness with others. People could sense when I was more concerned with managing their decisions than with genuinely serving their interests. That evening, as I reviewed the day's events, I marveled at how different it felt to work from a place of surrender rather than control. The meeting with the acquisition team had gone better than any scenario I could have planned because I hadn't been trying to manipulate a specific outcome. Instead of spending the evening creating new contingency plans for various possibilities, I found myself simply preparing to do excellent work regardless of what they decided. If they chose to continue the project, I would serve them well. If they decided to discontinue it, I would transition professionally and trust that other opportunities would emerge. For the first time in my career, I was experiencing what it felt like to work hard without being attached to specific results, to prepare thoroughly without trying to control outcomes, to care deeply about my clients' success without needing to manage their decisions. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote something I'd never written before. Today, I learned the difference between doing my part and trying to do God's part. My part is to work with excellence, integrity, and genuine care for others. God's part is to handle the outcomes, the timing, and the opportunities that flow from faithful work. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace about an uncertain situation. Not because I had figured out how to control the outcome, but because I had finally learned to trust the one who actually could take care of everything I couldn't manage myself. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this surrendered approach to work and relationships, and for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely excited to see how God would handle the things I had been exhausting myself trying to control. 3 days after my revelation about surrendering control, I faced my first major test when Jennifer from the acquiring company called with their decision about my project. As I saw her name on my phone screen, I felt the familiar impulse to brace for impact, to prepare mentally for disappointment, and to start formulating backup plans before I even heard what she had to say. But then I remembered God's words, "You try to control, but only I take care of everything." Instead of launching into control mode, I took a breath and answered with genuine openness to whatever news she had to share. "Andrew, I wanted to call you personally to let you know about our decision," Jennifer began. "After reviewing your project and discussing it with our integration team, we've decided to not only continue with your current work, but to expand it. We want you to help us apply your operational improvements across 3 additional facilities we're acquiring." My first reaction was gratitude, followed immediately by the old familiar surge of anxiety about taking on expanded responsibilities. What if I can't handle a project this large? What if the other facilities have complications I haven't anticipated? What if I overcommit and disappoint them? What if this success creates pressure I can't sustain? But before the anxious thoughts could spiral into full-blown panic, I found myself asking the question that was becoming my new default. God, how do you want me to respond to this opportunity? What emerged wasn't a detailed plan for managing every aspect of the expanded project, but a simple sense of confidence that if God had provided this opportunity, He would also provide the wisdom and resources to handle it well. "Jennifer, I'm honored by your confidence in my work," I replied. "I'd love to discuss the scope of the expanded project and make sure I can serve you well. When would be a good time to meet and go over the details?" After scheduling the meeting, I sat in my office marveling at how different this felt from my usual response to new opportunities. Normally, I would have immediately begun creating elaborate project management systems, detailed timelines, and comprehensive risk assessment protocols. Instead, I found myself simply grateful for the opportunity and curious about how God would guide me through the challenges ahead. The real test of my new approach came that afternoon when I met with my accountant, David, for our quarterly business review. David had been managing my finances for 3 years and had grown accustomed to my detailed spreadsheets, tracking every expense, elaborate budget projections, and multiple contingency plans for various revenue scenarios. "Andrew, I have to ask," David said as we reviewed my financial statements. "What happened to all your usual projections and scenario planning? Your business is doing better than ever, but you seem less obsessed with trying to predict and control every financial outcome." I shared with him about my recent breakthrough with surrendering control, about learning to distinguish between responsible planning and obsessive micromanagement. David leaned back in his chair with a knowing smile. "You know, I've been hoping you'd figure this out for years. Your business has always been profitable, but you've been making yourself miserable trying to guarantee outcomes that no amount of planning can actually guarantee." He pulled out a folder of documents I'd never seen before. "Andrew, I want to show you something. These are the financial records of my most successful clients over the past decade. What they all have in common isn't elaborate control systems. It's consistent excellence in their work, combined with flexibility in how they respond to opportunities and challenges." As David showed me examples of businesses that had thrived by focusing on quality service rather than outcome control, I began to understand something profound about the relationship between surrender and success. "The clients who struggle the most," David continued, "are the ones who spend so much energy trying to control their business environment that they miss opportunities right in front of them. But the ones who succeed long-term are those who work hard, serve their clients well, and remain open to possibilities they couldn't have planned." That evening, I had dinner with my longtime friend Mark, who owned a successful restaurant downtown. Mark had always impressed me with his ability to handle the unpredictable nature of the food service industry, dealing with staff turnover, supply chain disruptions, and constantly changing customer preferences, without seeming to stress about things beyond his control. "Mark, I have to ask you something," I said as we finished our meal. "How do you handle running a business where so many variables are completely outside your control? The restaurant industry seems like a nightmare for someone who needs to predict and manage every outcome." Mark laughed. "Andrew, that's exactly why I can't try to control everything. In the restaurant business, you learn quickly that you can control the quality of your food, the training of your staff, and the atmosphere you create. But you can't control the weather, the economy, food costs, or whether people decide to eat out on any given night," he continued. "The restaurant owners who fail are usually the ones who exhaust themselves trying to control things they can't influence. The ones who succeed focus on excellence in the areas they can control and adapt quickly to everything else." Mark's perspective resonated deeply with my recent experiences. "So, how do you know the difference between what you can control and what you need to surrender?" "I ask myself this question," Mark replied. "Can my effort directly influence this outcome, or am I just worrying about something that depends on factors beyond my reach? If it's the first, I work hard on it. If it's the second, I do my best and let go of the result." His simple framework felt like practical wisdom for applying what God had been teaching me about surrender and control. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity to practice this new approach. I received a call from a potential new client, a technology startup that needed help streamlining their operations before seeking additional funding. The project would be challenging, with tight deadlines and high stakes for their business. My old self would have immediately begun analyzing every possible complication, creating detailed project timelines with extensive buffer periods, and developing backup plans for various scenarios. Instead, I found myself simply listening to their needs and honestly assessing whether I could serve them well. "I'm interested in helping you," I told the startup founder, "but I want to be transparent about what I can and can't guarantee. I can promise you excellent work, honest communication, and my full commitment to your success. But the ultimate outcome of your funding efforts will depend on many factors beyond the scope of operational improvements." The founder was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. "That's exactly the kind of honesty we need. We've talked to other consultants who promised they could guarantee our funding success if we hired them. Your transparency makes me trust you more, not less." We scheduled a meeting for the following week, and I hung up the phone with a new understanding of how surrender actually enhances rather than undermines professional effectiveness. By being honest about the limits of what I could control, I had actually increased their confidence in my ability to handle what was within my sphere of influence. That afternoon, I called my mentor Richard to update him on the week's developments: the expanded project with the manufacturing company, the new startup opportunity, and my growing understanding of how surrender and success could work together. "Andrew, I'm proud of the progress you're making," Richard said, "but I want to prepare you for something. Learning to surrender control is a process, not a one-time breakthrough. You'll face situations that trigger your old need to control everything, and you'll have to choose surrender over and over again." His warning proved prophetic sooner than I expected. Later that evening, I received an email from the startup founder with additional details about their project that immediately triggered my old anxiety patterns. The timeline was tighter than I'd understood, the stakes were higher, and there were several variables that could significantly impact the project's success. As I read through the details, I felt the familiar surge of panic and the overwhelming urge to begin creating elaborate contingency plans for every possible complication. But before I could fall back into old patterns, I remembered God's promise: "Only I take care of everything." Instead of spending the evening developing complex project management systems, I simply prepared thoroughly for our upcoming meeting, researched their industry to understand their challenges better, and prayed for wisdom to serve them well regardless of what complications might arise. For the first time in my career, I was learning to work diligently without being anxious about outcomes, to prepare thoroughly without trying to control results, and to care deeply about my client's success without needing to manage factors beyond my influence. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how much my relationship with work was changing. The projects themselves hadn't become easier, but my approach to them was becoming more peaceful and, surprisingly, more effective. Clients seemed to trust me more when I was honest about what I could and couldn't control, and I was finding that surrender enhanced rather than undermined my professional capabilities. God, I prayed, thank you for showing me that surrendering control doesn't mean being irresponsible. Help me continue learning to do my part excellently while trusting you to handle everything else. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this balance between diligent work and peaceful surrender, and I was genuinely excited to see how God would continue teaching me to live and work from a place of trust rather than control. 2 weeks into practicing surrender over control, I encountered my most challenging test yet. It came in the form of a crisis with the expanded manufacturing project that threatened to unravel everything I thought I'd learned about trusting God while working diligently. The call came at 7:15 a.m. on a Monday from Tom Patterson, the operations manager at the main facility. His voice carried an urgency that immediately triggered every control instinct I'd been learning to surrender. "Andrew, we have a serious problem. The implementation you designed for the production line modifications isn't working the way we expected. We're seeing a 30% decrease in output instead of the projected increase, and upper management is questioning whether we should continue with your recommendations." My mind immediately exploded with panic responses. A 30% decrease? That's catastrophic. What if I miscalculated something fundamental? What if my entire approach is flawed? What if this failure destroys my reputation? What if the other facilities hear about this and lose confidence? What if they cancel the entire expanded project? What if I have to refund months of work? What if this ruins my business? The old Andrew would have immediately launched into damage control mode, demanding detailed data, creating multiple theories for what went wrong, developing elaborate plans to fix the situation, and essentially trying to single-handedly solve a problem that involved dozens of variables beyond my direct control. But as the panic thoughts swirled, I heard an echo of God's words. "You try to control, but only I take care of everything." In that moment, I had a choice between surrendering to my old patterns of trying to control the crisis or trusting that God could handle even this situation that felt completely overwhelming. "Tom, I understand this is serious," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'm going to drive out there this morning so we can look at the situation together. Before I arrive, can you gather the production data from the past week so we can understand exactly what's happening?" Instead of spending the drive to the facility spiraling through worst-case scenarios, I found myself praying, "God, I don't understand what's happening here, but you said you take care of everything. Help me approach this situation with wisdom and clarity instead of panic and control." When I arrived at the plant, Tom was waiting with a stack of production reports and a group of floor supervisors who looked concerned but not hostile. As we walked through the modified production area, I forced myself to observe and listen rather than immediately jumping to conclusions or defensive explanations. What I discovered over the next 2 hours was both humbling and enlightening. The implementation itself was technically sound, but there were 3 variables I hadn't adequately considered: the learning curve for workers adapting to new processes, seasonal fluctuations in raw material quality that affected production speed, and a communication gap between shifts that was creating inconsistencies in execution. The old Andrew would have been devastated by this revelation, seeing it as evidence of failure in planning and preparation. But the new understanding I was developing about surrender helped me approach these discoveries differently. "Tom, I can see what's happening here," I said as we concluded our review. "The implementation design is solid, but I underestimated some transitional factors that are affecting short-term results. Instead of scrapping the changes, I think we need to make some adjustments to address these specific issues." "What kind of adjustments?" he asked. "First, let's implement a more gradual transition schedule that gives workers additional time to adapt to the new processes. Second, let's create better communication protocols between shifts to ensure consistency. Third, let's adjust the production targets to account for seasonal material variations." As I outlined these modifications, I realized something profound was happening. Instead of trying to defend my original plan or prove that the problems weren't my fault, I was simply focusing on serving the client's needs, regardless of how it reflected on my planning abilities. Tom's response was immediate and positive. "That makes complete sense. I was worried you'd try to convince us that the problems were our fault or that we just needed to wait longer for results. This approach feels much more collaborative." Over the next 3 days, we implemented the adjustments I'd suggested. Instead of obsessively monitoring every metric and trying to control each variable in the transition, I found myself simply doing my part diligently while trusting that the outcomes would reflect the quality of the work. The results were remarkable. By the end of the week, production had not only returned to previous levels, but was beginning to show the improvements we had originally projected. More importantly, the relationships with the client team had actually strengthened through the crisis because of how we'd handled the challenges together. On Friday afternoon, Tom called with an update that left me speechless. "Andrew, I wanted you to know that upper management is so impressed with how you handled this situation that they want to accelerate the timeline for implementing your recommendations at the other facilities. They said they've never worked with a consultant who responded to problems by focusing on solutions rather than blame." After hanging up the phone, I sat in my office overwhelmed with gratitude for what God had taught me through this crisis. The situation that had initially felt like a potential disaster had become an opportunity to demonstrate a completely different approach to problem solving. One based on service rather than self-protection, collaboration rather than control. That evening, I called Richard to share the week's developments. His response helped me understand the deeper significance of what had happened. "Andrew, what you experienced this week is exactly why surrender enhances effectiveness rather than undermining it," he explained. "When you're not focused on protecting your image or controlling outcomes, you can respond to problems with creativity and collaboration. Clients sense that difference, and they trust you more because of it." He continued, "The consultants who struggle when things go wrong are usually the ones who are more concerned with being right than with being helpful. But when you approach problems as opportunities to serve rather than threats to manage, you often discover solutions you couldn't see when you were in control mode." The next Monday brought an opportunity to apply this lesson in a completely different context. My sister Rachel called with news that our elderly father had fallen and broken his hip. He would need surgery followed by several months of rehabilitation, and she was struggling to coordinate his care while managing her own family responsibilities. "Andrew, I don't know how to handle all of this," she said, clearly overwhelmed. "Dad needs someone to advocate for him with the medical team, coordinate his insurance, manage his finances while he recovers, and make sure his house is maintained. I feel like I need to control every aspect of his care, but there are so many variables I can't manage." Listening to Rachel describe her struggle with controlling our father's care situation, I recognized the same patterns I'd been learning to surrender in my business life. The difference was that now I had some experience with how surrender could actually enhance rather than undermine our ability to serve others effectively. Rachel, what if we approached Dad's situation the same way I've been learning to approach work challenges? What if we focused on doing our part excellently while trusting God to handle the outcomes we can't control? We spent the next hour identifying what was actually within our control, researching the best rehabilitation facilities, communicating clearly with his medical team, organizing his finances, and providing emotional support, versus what we needed to surrender, the pace of his recovery, insurance decisions, and the ultimate outcome of his rehabilitation. By the end of our conversation, Rachel sounded calmer and more focused. I've been so overwhelmed trying to guarantee that everything goes perfectly for Dad. But you're right. I can do my part well without trying to control outcomes that are ultimately in God's hands. Over the following weeks, as we navigated our father's medical situation, I had repeated opportunities to practice surrender in a deeply personal context. Each time I felt the urge to try to control his recovery timeline or manage every aspect of his care, I remembered God's promise that He takes care of everything I can't handle. The result was that I was able to be more present with my father, more supportive of Rachel, and more effective in the areas where I could actually make a difference. Instead of exhausting myself trying to manage outcomes beyond my control, I focused my energy on providing practical help and emotional support where it was truly needed. As I reflected on these experiences, the manufacturing project crisis, and my father's medical situation, I began to understand that God's invitation to surrender control wasn't just about reducing my stress levels. It was about discovering a completely different way of engaging with challenges that was both more peaceful and more effective than my old approach of trying to manage everything myself. God, I prayed that night, thank you for showing me that surrender doesn't mean being passive or irresponsible. Help me continue learning to work diligently in the areas where you've given me influence, while trusting you completely with the outcomes I can't control. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this balance, and I was beginning to genuinely look forward to discovering how God would handle the things I was learning to release to His care. A month into my father's recovery process, I faced a test of surrender that would challenge everything I thought I understood about the balance between responsibility and control. It began with a phone call from his rehabilitation facility that sent my mind immediately into crisis management mode. Mr. Anderson, this is Dr. Martinez from Valley Rehabilitation Center. Your father had a setback during physical therapy yesterday. He's experiencing increased pain and mobility issues that weren't part of his expected recovery pattern. We need to discuss some changes to his treatment plan. My first reaction was the familiar surge of control-oriented thinking. A setback? What went wrong? Should I have chosen a different facility? Do I need to get a second opinion? What if his recovery is permanently compromised? What if I failed to advocate properly for his care? Should I transfer him somewhere else? What if I'm not managing his situation effectively? But before I could spiral into full panic mode, I caught myself and remembered what I'd been learning about surrendering outcomes while remaining diligent in my responsibilities. Dr. Martinez, I appreciate you calling me directly, I said, taking a breath to center myself. Can we schedule a time for me to come in and discuss the situation in detail? I want to understand what's happening and how we can best support his recovery moving forward. The meeting with Dr. Martinez the next morning was a masterclass in the difference between being engaged and being controlling. Instead of arriving with predetermined solutions or demands for specific treatments, I came prepared to listen, understand, and collaborate on the best path forward. Your father's setback isn't uncommon for patients his age, Dr. Martinez explained. Hip fracture recovery in elderly patients often involves periods of progress, followed by temporary plateaus or even regression. The key is adjusting our approach based on how his body is responding rather than forcing a predetermined timeline. The old Andrew would have peppered her with questions about why this wasn't anticipated, whether we needed to change facilities, and what guarantees she could provide about future progress. Instead, I found myself asking, what adjustments do you recommend, and how can I best support those changes? As we developed a modified care plan that included additional pain management, adjusted physical therapy goals, and more realistic timeline expectations, I experienced something remarkable. By focusing on how I could serve my father's actual needs rather than trying to control his recovery outcomes, I was able to be more helpful and less stressed. This lesson in medical surrender prepared me for an even more significant test that arrived that same week. The technology startup I'd been working with called an emergency meeting to discuss a crisis that threatened their entire funding strategy. "Andrew, we need your help," said Jennifer, the startup founder, as we gathered in their conference room. "The investors we've been courting for the past 3 months just pulled out of negotiations. They cited concerns about our operational efficiency, exactly the areas you've been helping us improve. We're not sure if we should pivot our approach, seek different investors, or fundamentally restructure our business model." My mind immediately began generating control-oriented responses. What if my operational improvements weren't adequate? What if I gave them bad advice? What if I need to completely redesign their systems? What if this failure reflects poorly on my consulting abilities? What if other potential clients hear about this and lose confidence in my work? But instead of being overwhelmed by these thoughts, I found myself asking the question that had become my anchor in uncertain situations. God, how do you want me to serve Jennifer and her team in this crisis? What emerged wasn't a defensive reaction or an attempt to control the outcome, but a genuine desire to help them navigate their challenge, regardless of how it might reflect on my previous work. "Jennifer, I'm sorry to hear about the investor situation," I began. "Before we discuss next steps, can you help me understand specifically what concerns the investors raised? I want to make sure we're addressing the real issues rather than just reacting to the disappointment." As Jennifer and her team shared details about the investors' feedback, I listened without immediately trying to defend my recommendations or prove that the problems weren't related to my work. Instead, I focused on understanding what the investors had actually identified as concerns. What emerged was illuminating. The investors hadn't rejected the company because of operational inefficiencies. In fact, they had praised the improvements we'd implemented. Their withdrawal was based on broader market conditions and portfolio diversification decisions that had nothing to do with the startup's performance or potential. "So the operational improvements aren't the problem," I summarized. "The challenge is that you need to find investors whose portfolio strategy aligns with your market sector during current economic conditions." "Exactly," Jennifer confirmed. "But we're not sure how to identify those investors or how to position ourselves for different types of funding conversations." The old Andrew would have immediately tried to solve this investor relations challenge, even though it was completely outside my expertise area. The new understanding I was developing about the boundaries of my responsibility helped me respond differently. "Jennifer, investor relations and funding strategy aren't areas where I have expertise to offer," I said honestly. "But I know some people who specialize in that field. Would it be helpful if I connected you with professionals who can guide you through the funding challenge while I continue supporting the operational improvements that will make you attractive to the right investors?" The relief on Jennifer's face was immediate. "That would be incredibly helpful. We've been feeling like we needed to figure out everything ourselves, but you're right. We need specialists for different aspects of building our business." Over the next 2 weeks, I connected Jennifer's team with a funding strategist who specialized in their industry sector while continuing to refine their operational systems. Instead of trying to control their entire business development process, I focused on excelling in my area of expertise while trusting others to handle aspects outside my sphere of competence. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The funding strategist helped them identify investors who were actively seeking opportunities in their market sector, while the operational improvements I'd implemented made them attractive candidates for investment. Within a month, they had secured funding that exceeded their original goal. "Andrew, I have to tell you something," Jennifer said during our final project review meeting. "When the first investor situation fell through, we were tempted to blame you and look for different consulting help. But your response to that crisis, focusing on how to help us rather than defending your work, convinced us that we were working with the right person." She continued, "More than that, watching you refer us to specialists in areas outside your expertise taught us something important about building a business. We don't have to be experts in everything. We just need to excel in our core competencies and collaborate with others who can handle the rest." That evening, as I reflected on the week's events, I realized that God was teaching me something profound about the relationship between surrender and professional success. The more clearly I understood the boundaries of what I could and couldn't control, the more effective I became in the areas where I could make a real difference. My father's medical situation was progressing as well as could be expected for his age and condition. The startup had secured funding and was implementing operational improvements that positioned them for growth. The manufacturing company was seeing sustained improvements across all their facilities. None of these outcomes were guaranteed when I started practicing surrender, but all of them had unfolded more smoothly because I had learned to focus my energy on what I could actually influence. I called Richard to share these insights, and his response helped me understand the broader implications of what I was learning. "Andrew, what you're discovering is one of the most important principles of effective leadership and consulting," he said. "People trust you more when you're honest about the limits of what you can control or guarantee. And they get better results when you focus your expertise on areas where you can actually make a difference, rather than trying to manage everything." He paused, then added, "But the deeper lesson is about peace. When you're not carrying the burden of trying to control outcomes that were never yours to manage, you have more energy and clarity to do excellent work in the areas where you can contribute. Surrender doesn't make you less effective, it makes you more focused." As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about how dramatically my relationship with work and responsibility had changed over the past 2 months. I was working as hard as ever, but the work felt more purposeful and less stressful. I cared deeply about my clients' success, but I wasn't exhausting myself trying to guarantee specific outcomes. "God," I prayed, "thank you for showing me that surrender actually enhances effectiveness rather than undermining it. Help me continue growing in wisdom about what belongs to me and what belongs to you. Teach me to work diligently while resting in your care." Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this balance between faithful effort and peaceful surrender. And I was genuinely excited to see how God would continue teaching me to live and work from a place of trust rather than control. 6 weeks into my journey of learning surrender, I encountered an opportunity that would test whether I could apply these principles to the most challenging area of my life, my relationship with money and financial security. It came in the form of an unexpected conversation with my financial advisor, Susan, during what was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. "Andrew, I need to discuss something concerning with you," Susan said as we reviewed my investment portfolio. "Your approach to financial planning has always been extremely conservative. Multiple emergency funds, over-diversified investments, insurance policies for every conceivable scenario. But lately, I've been wondering if your fear-based approach to money management might actually be limiting your financial growth." Her observation hit me like a revelation. I had never connected my need to control outcomes with my approach to finances. But as she spoke, I realized that my relationship with money was perhaps the area where my control issues were most deeply entrenched. "What do you mean by fear-based?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "You currently have 18 months of expenses in emergency savings, which is far beyond what most financial advisors recommend. You're invested so conservatively that your returns barely keep pace with inflation. You have insurance policies that overlap significantly because you want to be prepared for every possible scenario. It's like you're trying to guarantee financial outcomes that can't actually be guaranteed. As Susan continued describing my financial patterns, I saw clearly how my quest for control had infected every aspect of my money management. I was so focused on preventing financial disaster that I was missing opportunities for growth. My attempts to control financial outcomes were actually working against my long-term financial health. Susan, if you were advising someone who wanted to take a more balanced approach to financial planning, one that included appropriate preparation without excessive control, what would you recommend? Her response challenged every assumption I'd held about financial security. I'd recommend maintaining 3 to 6 months of emergency savings instead of 18. I'd suggest a more balanced investment portfolio that includes some calculated risk for better long-term returns. And I'd focus on building wealth through consistent, wise decisions rather than trying to insure against every possible financial setback. The conversation triggered every anxiety I'd ever had about money. What if I reduce my emergency fund and then face an unexpected crisis? What if I invest more aggressively and lose money in a market downturn? What if I don't have enough insurance and face a catastrophic expense? What if trusting God with my finances leads to financial ruin? But as these fears surfaced, I remembered God's words. You try to control, but only I take care of everything. The same principle that was transforming my approach to work and relationships needed to be applied to my financial life. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where God had first spoken to me about surrender, and prayed about my relationship with money. God, I can see that my approach to finances is driven by the same control issues you've been helping me address in other areas. Show me how to be financially responsible while trusting you with outcomes I can't guarantee. What emerged wasn't a reckless abandonment of financial planning, but a more balanced understanding of the difference between wise stewardship and fearful control. Over the following week, I began implementing changes that felt both terrifying and liberating. I reduced my emergency fund from 18 months to 6 months of expenses, investing the difference in a more balanced portfolio. I consolidated overlapping insurance policies, maintaining adequate coverage without excessive redundancy. Most significantly, I started making financial decisions based on wisdom and research, rather than worst-case scenario planning. The real test came when Jennifer from the startup called with an unexpected proposal. Andrew, our funding came through better than expected, and we're in a position to expand faster than we originally planned. We'd like to hire you as a part-time operations consultant for the next year, but it would require you to turn down other potential clients to ensure availability. Are you interested? My immediate reaction was to analyze every possible financial implication. What if their expansion fails and they can't maintain the consulting contract? What if turning down other clients leaves me financially vulnerable? What if I should negotiate a guaranteed payment structure? What if this opportunity is too risky given my other commitments? But instead of letting financial anxiety drive my decision, I found myself applying the surrender principles I'd been learning. I focused on whether this was an opportunity where I could add genuine value, whether it aligned with my professional goals, and whether it felt like a wise use of my expertise. Jennifer, I'm interested in the role, but I want to make sure I can serve you well, I replied. Can we structure the arrangement so that it works for both of us, providing you with the consistency you need, while allowing me to maintain some flexibility for other commitments? The conversation that followed was one of the most collaborative client discussions I'd ever had. Instead of trying to control every aspect of the financial arrangement, I focused on creating a structure that served both parties' needs. We developed a consulting agreement that provided them with priority access to my services, while allowing me to maintain relationships with other clients. The financial terms were actually better than what I would have negotiated from a place of fear-based control, Because I wasn't trying to guarantee specific outcomes or protect against every possible scenario, I was able to focus on creating genuine value, which commanded better compensation. But the most significant change wasn't in the contract terms. It was in how I felt about the agreement. Instead of anxiety about financial security, I experienced excitement about the opportunity to contribute to a growing company. Instead of worry about what might go wrong, I felt curious about how God would use this partnership to develop my skills and serve others. That weekend I visited my father, who was making steady progress in his rehabilitation. As we sat in his room at the assisted living facility, he made an observation that surprised me. "Andrew, you seem different lately, more relaxed, even though I know you're dealing with my medical situation and growing your business. What's changed?" I shared with him about my journey of learning to surrender control, about discovering the difference between responsibility and trying to manage outcomes beyond my influence. "Son, I wish I had learned that lesson 40 years ago," he said quietly. "I spent so much of my life trying to control things that were never mine to control. Your mother used to tell me that worry was like paying interest on trouble that might never come due." He continued, "Watching you handle my medical situation has been different from how you used to approach challenges. You're just as helpful and engaged, but you seem peaceful about things you can't change. That's wisdom I never developed." My father's observation helped me realize how visible the transformation was becoming. People could see the difference between someone who was working hard while trying to control everything and someone who was working hard while trusting God with the outcomes. The following Monday brought another opportunity to practice financial surrender when Susan called with a market update. "Andrew, there's been some volatility in the market sectors where we increased your investments. Your portfolio has declined about 8% over the past 2 weeks. How are you feeling about the changes we made?" The old Andrew would have immediately panicked, demanded that we return to the ultra-conservative approach, and spent days analyzing whether I had made a terrible mistake by trusting her recommendations. Instead, I found myself responding with the calm that comes from surrender. "Susan, market volatility is exactly what we discussed when we made these changes. I understood that there would be fluctuations, and 8% is well within the range we anticipated. Unless you see fundamental problems with our long-term strategy, I'm comfortable staying the course." Her relief was audible. That's exactly the right response. Most clients call in a panic when they see any decline, even when it's completely normal market behavior. Your ability to focus on long-term strategy rather than short-term fluctuations will serve you much better financially. Over the following weeks, the market recovered and my portfolio returned to growth. But more importantly, I had learned that I could handle financial uncertainty without abandoning wise planning or falling into control-based anxiety. That month marked a turning point in how I approached every aspect of life. The principles of surrender I was learning weren't just changing my work relationships. They were transforming how I handled money, family responsibilities, health concerns, and future planning. I was discovering that God's promise to take care of everything didn't mean I could be passive or irresponsible. It meant I could work diligently, plan wisely, and prepare appropriately, while trusting Him with outcomes that were ultimately beyond my control. As I reflected on the changes of the past 2 months, I marveled at how much more peaceful and effective my life had become. I was earning more money while worrying less about financial security. I was serving clients better while being less anxious about their satisfaction. I was caring for my father more effectively while being less stressed about his recovery timeline. "God," I prayed that night, "thank you for showing me that surrender isn't about being careless with the responsibilities you've given me. It's about being faithful in what belongs to me, while trusting you with what belongs to you. Help me continue growing in this wisdom." Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this balance between diligent effort and peaceful trust. and I was beginning to understand that this was how God intended life to be lived, working hard while resting in His care, planning wisely while trusting His provision, caring deeply while remaining at peace about outcomes beyond my control. 3 months into my journey of surrender, I faced a test that would challenge me to apply these principles in the most personal and vulnerable area of my life: relationships. It began with a call from my ex-wife Sarah, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 2 years since our divorce was finalized. "Andrew, I hope it's okay that I'm calling," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of hesitancy and urgency. "I know we agreed to minimal contact, but something has happened that affects both of us. My father passed away last week, and in going through his papers, we discovered that he had named you as executor of his estate. The news hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's father, Robert, had been like a second father to me during our marriage. His decision to name me as executor was both an honor and a complication that immediately triggered every control instinct I'd been learning to surrender. "Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it deeply. "Your father was a good man who was always kind to me, even after the divorce. But I have to ask, are you comfortable with me serving as executor? I don't want to create additional stress during an already difficult time." "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling," she replied. "The family discussed it, and we think Dad made a wise choice. You were always good at managing complex situations, and Dad trusted your judgment. But I want to make sure we can work together professionally without complications." As we talked about the practical aspects of settling Robert's estate, I felt the familiar urge to try to control every aspect of our interaction, to predict how Sarah might react to various decisions, to manage her emotions and expectations, to guarantee that our professional relationship wouldn't create personal conflict. But then I remembered God's words about taking care of everything I couldn't control. Instead of trying to orchestrate the perfect outcome for our renewed contact, I focused on simply being helpful, honest, and respectful while trusting God to handle the emotional dynamics I couldn't manage. "Sarah, I'm honored that your father trusted me with this responsibility, and I'll do everything I can to handle the estate according to his wishes and in the best interests of your family. If at any point the situation becomes uncomfortable for you or anyone else, please let me know and we can discuss alternatives." Over the following weeks, as I worked with Sarah and her family to settle Robert's estate, I had repeated opportunities to practice surrender in the context of our complicated history. The old Andrew would have tried to control how she perceived my decisions, manage her reactions to various estate matters, and orchestrate interactions to avoid any potential conflict. Instead, I found myself simply focusing on being faithful to Robert's wishes and serving the family's needs, while trusting God to handle the relational dynamics I couldn't control. The breakthrough moment came during a family meeting to discuss the distribution of Robert's assets. There was disagreement among Sarah's siblings about whether to sell the family home or keep it as a rental property. The discussion was becoming heated, and I could see that my presence as both executor and Sarah's ex-husband was adding complexity to an already emotional situation. My old instinct would have been to try to manage the family dynamics, perhaps by taking sides or offering solutions designed to please everyone. Instead, I found myself saying something that surprised even me. "This is clearly a decision that needs to be made by the family. As executor, my role is to implement whatever you decide and ensure that it's handled according to legal requirements. Why don't I step out while you discuss this, and you can let me know what you'd like me to do?" Sarah's youngest brother, Mark, spoke up immediately. "Andrew, stay. You're not trying to control our decision, and that's exactly why Dad wanted you involved. We need someone who can implement our choices without pushing their own agenda." The family ultimately decided to sell the house, and the process went smoothly because I was able to focus on execution rather than trying to influence their decision. More importantly, my relationship with Sarah evolved into something I hadn't expected, a respectful, collaborative partnership focused on honoring her father's memory. "Andrew, I need to tell you something," Sarah said, as we concluded the final estate paperwork. "When Dad first told me he was naming you as executor, I was concerned about how we'd work together, but watching you handle this process has been healing in a way I didn't expect." "What do you mean?" I asked. "During our marriage, you were always trying to fix or control situations, especially when they involved emotions or family dynamics. But throughout this process, you've been helpful without being controlling, engaged without being manipulative. It's shown me a side of you I wish I had seen more of when we were married." Her words were both healing and sobering. They confirmed that my need to control had affected our relationship in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time, but they also showed that the changes I was making were real and visible to others. This experience with Sarah prepared me for an even more challenging test that arrived the following week. Jennifer from the startup called with news that would require me to apply surrender principles in a high-stakes business situation. "Andrew, we've received an acquisition offer from a major technology company," she said. "It's a good offer, but the timeline is compressed. They want a decision within 2 weeks. The challenge is that they're evaluating not just our company, but all our key relationships, including consultants. They want to interview you as part of their due diligence process." My mind immediately began spinning through control scenarios. What if I say something that undermines their acquisition? What if the acquiring company doesn't like my approach? What if I should modify my consulting style to impress them? What if my honesty about limitations hurts Jennifer's chances? What if I try to control the interview outcome and make things worse? But before I could spiral into control mode, I asked the question that had become my anchor. "God, how do you want me to approach this interview? What would serving Jennifer's best interests look like in this situation?" The answer that emerged was simple but profound. Be completely honest about my role, the results we'd achieved, and the limitations of what I could guarantee, while trusting that authentic representation would serve everyone's interests better than any attempt to control their perception. The acquisition team interview was unlike any professional conversation I'd ever had. Instead of trying to impress them or manage their opinions of my work, I simply answered their questions honestly and thoroughly. "Can you guarantee that the operational improvements you've implemented will scale as the company grows?" asked the lead analyst. "No, I can't guarantee that," I replied. "What I can tell you is that the systems we've developed are designed with scalability in mind, based on industry best practices and Jennifer's specific business model. But growth always brings new challenges that require ongoing attention and adaptation." The interviewer seemed surprised by my honesty. "Most consultants try to assure us that their solutions will handle any future scenario. In my experience, that kind of guarantee isn't realistic or helpful," I said. "What I can promise is that the foundation we've built is solid, the team understands the systems well, and the improvements we've made position the company to handle growth more effectively than they could before." The interview continued for an hour, with me consistently choosing honesty over impression management, service over self-promotion, and authentic representation over control-based manipulation of their perceptions. 2 days later, Jennifer called with the results. "Andrew, I need to share something remarkable with you. The acquisition team said that your interview was one of the most refreshing consultant conversations they'd ever had. They said most consultants either oversell their contributions or try to position themselves as indispensable. Your honesty about what you had and hadn't accomplished, combined with your clear focus on our company's interests rather than your own, convinced them that we work with people of integrity." She paused, then continued, "The acquisition is moving forward, and they've asked if you'd be willing to consult with them on integrating our operational systems with their larger infrastructure. Your approach to the interview didn't hurt our chances, it enhanced them." That evening, as I reflected on the week's events, successfully navigating the complex dynamics with Sarah and her family, and approaching the high-stakes acquisition interview with surrender rather than control, I realized that God was showing me something profound about how authentic relationships and business success actually work. When I stopped trying to control other people's perceptions and decisions, they began to trust me more, not less. When I focused on serving their interests rather than managing outcomes in my favor, the results were better than anything I could have orchestrated through manipulation or control. I called Richard to share these insights, and his response helped me understand the broader implications of what I was learning. Andrew, what you're discovering is one of the most important principles of leadership and influence, he said. People can sense when you're trying to control them or manipulate their decisions, and it makes them trust you less. But when they sense that you're genuinely focused on their best interests without attachment to specific outcomes for yourself, they're much more likely to value your input and continue working with you, he continued. The deeper lesson is about authenticity. When you're not expending energy trying to control how people perceive you, you can focus on actually being the kind of person worthy of their trust and respect. As I prepared for bed that night, I marveled at how surrender was transforming not just my stress levels, but the quality of my relationships and the effectiveness of my work. By trusting God to handle outcomes I couldn't control, I was becoming more present, more authentic, and more genuinely helpful to the people in my life. God, I prayed, thank you for showing me that surrender actually enhances relationships rather than undermining them. Help me continue growing in this wisdom, trusting you with outcomes while focusing on being faithful in how I love and serve others. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this balance between caring deeply and releasing control, and I was genuinely excited to see how God would continue teaching me to love and work from a place of trust rather than control. 4 months into my journey of learning surrender, I faced a crisis that would test whether I could maintain my newfound peace when everything I had built seemed to be falling apart simultaneously. It began on a Tuesday morning with 3 phone calls that arrived within 20 minutes of each other, each carrying news that would have sent the old Andrew into complete control panic. The first call came from my father's assisted living facility. "Mr. Anderson, your father had another fall during the night. He's stable, but we need to discuss whether his current level of care is still appropriate for his needs." The second call was from Jennifer at the startup. "Andrew, the acquisition deal fell through at the last minute. The parent company had budget cuts and our project was cancelled. We need to discuss how this affects our consulting arrangement." The third call was from my own doctor's office. "Mr. Anderson, we need you to come in to discuss your recent test results. There are some findings we need to investigate further." As I sat in my office after these 3 conversations, I felt the familiar surge of control-oriented panic trying to overwhelm me. Every instinct I'd developed over 34 years was screaming at me to immediately begin damage control, to create elaborate plans for managing each crisis, to somehow find a way to orchestrate positive outcomes through sheer force of will. But in the midst of the mental chaos, I heard an echo of God's words. "You try to control, but only I take care of everything." In that moment, I had a choice between surrendering to my old patterns of trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously, or trusting that God could handle even this convergence of challenges. Instead of immediately launching into crisis management mode, I did something I'd never done before. When facing major difficulties, I stopped and prayed. "God, I'm looking at 3 situations that feel overwhelming when I consider trying to control their outcomes. My father's health, my business stability, and my own health. These all matter deeply to me, but I can't manage any of them through worry or elaborate planning. Help me approach each situation with wisdom while trusting you with results I can't guarantee." What emerged from that prayer wasn't a detailed action plan for managing every variable, but a simple clarity about what my actual responsibilities were in each situation. For my father, my responsibility was to advocate for his needs, explore appropriate care options, and provide emotional support, not to control his aging process or guarantee specific health outcomes. For the business situation, my responsibility was to serve Jennifer's company well during their transition, maintain my professional commitments, and adapt to changing circumstances, not to prevent setbacks or guarantee continuous revenue. For my health concern, my responsibility was to follow medical recommendations, seek appropriate care, and make wise lifestyle choices, not to control my body's responses or manage diagnostic outcomes through anxiety. I spent the rest of that morning addressing each situation from this place of surrendered responsibility rather than controlling panic. I scheduled a meeting with my father's care team to discuss his needs objectively. I called Jennifer to offer continued support during their transition period. I made an appointment with my doctor to discuss the test results without catastrophic speculation. The most remarkable thing about this approach was how much clearer my thinking became when I wasn't exhausting myself trying to control outcomes beyond my influence. Instead of being paralyzed by the convergence of multiple crises, I was able to respond to each one thoughtfully and effectively. The meeting at my father's facility that afternoon was a masterclass in the difference between advocating and controlling. The care team recommended transitioning him to a higher level of assisted living that would provide additional medical support and fall prevention. My old response would have been to resist this recommendation, to seek multiple second opinions, to research every possible alternative, and essentially to try to find a way to guarantee his safety and independence simultaneously. Instead, I found myself asking practical questions about the proposed care level, touring the recommended facility, and involving my father in the decision-making process. When he expressed concerns about losing independence, I acknowledged his feelings without trying to manage his emotions or control his response to the transition. "Dad, this is your decision to make," I said as we discussed the options. "I'm here to help you understand the choices and support whatever you decide, but I can't promise that any option will guarantee specific outcomes. What I can promise is that we'll navigate this together." His response surprised me. "Son, I appreciate that you're not trying to make this decision for me or promise me things you can't control. It makes me trust your advice more, not less." Within a week, my father had moved to the enhanced care facility, and both his safety and his spirits improved. The transition went smoothly, not because I had controlled every variable, but because I had focused on supporting his actual needs rather than trying to manage his experience. The business situation required a different kind of surrender. When I met with Jennifer to discuss the failed acquisition, I discovered that my approach to their crisis would determine whether our professional relationship continued or ended. "Andrew, I need to be honest with you," Jennifer began. "The acquisition failure means we need to significantly reduce expenses, including consulting costs. We can't maintain our current arrangement, but we'd like to explore whether there's a scaled-back way to continue working together." My first instinct was to immediately begin strategizing ways to maintain my revenue from their project, perhaps by offering discounted rates, expanding services, or finding ways to make myself indispensable to their operations. But instead of trying to control the outcome of our conversation, I focused on genuinely serving their needs during a difficult transition. "Jennifer, I understand completely," I said. "My priority is helping your company navigate this challenge successfully. Let's discuss what support would be most valuable given your new constraints, and we can structure something that works within your budget." The conversation that followed was one of the most collaborative client discussions I'd ever had. Instead of negotiating from a place of trying to secure my own interests, I genuinely explored how I could best serve theirs. The result was a modified consulting arrangement that provided them with strategic support at a reduced cost while maintaining our professional relationship. "Andrew, I have to tell you something," Jennifer said as we concluded our meeting. I was dreading this conversation because I expected you to try to convince us to maintain the full consulting fee or to find ways to make us feel like we couldn't succeed without your services. Your willingness to adapt to our situation and focus on what we actually need makes me confident that we're working with the right person, even in a reduced capacity. The medical situation provided the most personal test of surrender. When I met with my doctor to discuss the test results, I learned that I had early indicators of a condition that would require monitoring and lifestyle changes, but wasn't immediately threatening. The good news is that we caught this early, Dr. Peterson explained. With appropriate management, this shouldn't significantly impact your quality of life, but you'll need regular monitoring and some modifications to your diet and exercise routine. My old response would have been to become obsessive about controlling every aspect of my health, researching every possible treatment option, creating elaborate diet and exercise regimens, and essentially trying to guarantee specific health outcomes through perfectionist management of every variable. Instead, I found myself simply asking what changes would be most beneficial and committing to implementing them consistently without obsessing over outcomes I couldn't control. Dr. Peterson, what are the most important steps I can take to manage this condition well? I asked. I want to be responsible about my health without becoming anxious about factors beyond my control. Over the following weeks, as I implemented the recommended lifestyle changes, I experienced something remarkable. By focusing on faithfully following medical advice rather than trying to control health outcomes, I felt both more peaceful and more confident about my long-term wellness. But the most profound realization came when I reflected on how differently I had handled this convergence of challenges compared to how I would have responded 6 months earlier. Instead of being overwhelmed by the need to control multiple crisis situations simultaneously, I had been able to address each one thoughtfully while maintaining peace about outcomes beyond my influence. That weekend, I called my sister Rachel to share about the week's events and what I was learning about surrender in crisis situations. "Andrew, I'm amazed at how you're handling all of this," she said. "A few months ago, any one of these situations would have sent you into weeks of anxious planning and control efforts, but you sound peaceful even while dealing with Dad's health, your business challenges, and your own medical concerns. I think I'm finally learning the difference between being responsible and trying to be in control," I replied. "I can take care of my responsibilities in each situation without exhausting myself trying to guarantee specific outcomes." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said something that helped me understand the broader significance of what I was learning. "Andrew, what you're describing sounds like wisdom, not just practical wisdom about managing situations, but spiritual wisdom about trusting God with results while being faithful with your part." Her observation resonated deeply. I was beginning to understand that surrender wasn't just a stress management technique. It was a way of living that allowed me to be more effective, more peaceful, and more present in all aspects of life. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how God's promise to take care of everything had proven true even in a week when multiple crises converged simultaneously. He hadn't prevented the challenges, but he had provided wisdom, peace, and practical guidance for navigating them without being overwhelmed by the need to control outcomes beyond my influence. "God," I prayed, "thank you for showing me this week that surrender works even when multiple difficult situations arise at once. Thank you for proving that I can handle challenges more effectively when I focus on my responsibilities while trusting you with results. Help me continue growing in this wisdom." Tomorrow would bring continued opportunities to practice surrender in the midst of ongoing challenges, and I was beginning to understand that this was how life was meant to be lived, responding to difficulties with faithful effort while resting in God's care for outcomes beyond my control. 6 months after God first spoke those transformative words to me, I found myself in a situation that would have been unthinkable during my controlling days. I was being invited to speak at a business leadership conference about leading through uncertainty with peace and effectiveness. The irony wasn't lost on me that my greatest weakness had become the foundation for helping others. The invitation came from Richard, my mentor, who had been watching my transformation over the past months. "Andrew, the conference organizers are looking for speakers who can address the challenge of leading effectively when outcomes are uncertain. Your journey from control-based anxiety to surrendered effectiveness is exactly what business leaders need to hear." My first reaction was the familiar surge of performance anxiety. What if I'm not qualified to speak about leadership? What if my personal experience doesn't translate to business advice? What if I disappoint the audience? What if I embarrass myself or Richard? What if my message doesn't resonate with successful executives? But before I could spiral into control mode, I caught myself and asked the question that had become my anchor. God, is this an opportunity to serve others with what you've taught me about surrender? The answer came as a peaceful confidence that surprised me. Instead of needing to control the audience's response or guarantee a specific outcome, I could simply share honestly about my journey and trust that it would serve whoever needed to hear it. "Richard, I'd be honored to speak at the conference," I said. "I can share about what I've learned regarding the difference between responsibility and control, and how surrender actually enhances rather than undermines effectiveness." Preparing for the presentation became an exercise in practicing what I would be teaching. Instead of trying to craft a speech that would impress everyone or control their perception of my expertise, I focused on honestly sharing my story and the practical lessons I'd learned about working diligently while trusting God with outcomes. The morning of the conference, I woke up with nervous energy but not the paralyzing anxiety I would have experienced months earlier. As I reviewed my notes one final time, I prayed, "God, use this story to help whoever needs to hear it. I can't control how people respond, but I can be faithful to share what you've taught me." Standing before an audience of 300 business leaders, I began with complete vulnerability. 6 months ago, I was sitting on my kitchen floor at midnight, surrounded by contingency plans and spreadsheets, exhausted from trying to control every outcome in my business and personal life. That night, God spoke to my heart with words that changed everything. "Andrew, you try to control, but only I take care of everything." I shared the complete journey, the client acquisition crisis that triggered my breakdown, the night of desperate prayer, and the gradual discovery that surrender actually enhanced rather than undermined my effectiveness as a consultant and business owner. The transformation wasn't about becoming passive or irresponsible, I explained to the audience. It was about learning to distinguish between what belongs to me, my effort, preparation, and faithful execution, and what belongs to God, the outcomes, other people's decisions, and circumstances beyond my influence. I described practical examples from my recent experiences, how focusing on serving clients rather than controlling their decisions had actually improved my business relationships, how being honest about limitations had increased rather than decreased client trust, how surrendering financial anxiety had led to better financial decisions and outcomes. The business leaders who struggle most with stress and effectiveness are often those who exhaust themselves trying to control variables beyond their influence, I continued. But when you learn to work excellently while trusting outcomes to forces larger than yourself, whether you call that God, providence, or market forces, you become both more peaceful and more effective. The response during the Q&A session revealed how deeply these concepts resonated with experienced business leaders. How do you know when you're being responsible versus when you're trying to control outcomes? Asked a CEO from a major manufacturing company. I ask myself whether my effort can directly influence the result, I replied. If I can impact it through preparation, skill, or diligence, it's my responsibility. If it depends on other people's decisions, market conditions, or circumstances beyond my reach, I do my best and release the outcome. Doesn't this approach make you less competitive in business? Questioned a venture capital executive. Actually, it's made me more competitive, I answered. When I'm not exhausting myself trying to control outcomes, I have more energy and clarity to excel in areas where I can actually make a difference. Clients sense the difference between someone who's trying to manipulate results and someone who's focused on genuine service. After the presentation, the response was overwhelming. Business leader after business leader approached to share their own struggles with control-based anxiety and to ask for guidance about applying these principles in their organizations. But the most meaningful conversation came with Maria, a startup founder who reminded me of myself 6 months earlier. Andrew, I've been building my company for 3 years, and I'm exhausted from trying to control every variable. I plan for every possible scenario, try to manage every relationship, and lose sleep over factors I can't influence. How did you learn to let go without feeling irresponsible? I recognized the desperation in her voice because I had felt it so deeply myself. Maria, what if I told you that your need to control everything is actually limiting your effectiveness rather than enhancing it? What if surrender could make you a better leader, not a weaker one? We talked for 20 minutes about her specific challenges, investor relationships she was trying to manage, market conditions she was attempting to predict, team dynamics she was trying to orchestrate. With each example, I helped her identify what was actually within her sphere of influence versus what she was exhausting herself trying to control. Your job as a founder isn't to guarantee specific outcomes, I explained. It's to make wise decisions, execute excellently, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The outcomes depend on many factors beyond your control, and accepting that reality will actually make you more effective, not less. By the end of our conversation, Maria looked lighter, as if someone had lifted a weight from her shoulders. I never thought about it this way. I've been so focused on trying to control results that I've been missing opportunities to simply excel at what I can actually influence. She asked for my contact information, and over the following weeks, we had several conversations as she applied surrender principles to her leadership approach. The transformation was remarkable, not just in her stress levels, but in her team's response to her more peaceful, collaborative leadership style. A month after the conference, I received an unexpected call from David Chen, a business consultant who had been in the audience that day. Andrew, I've been thinking about your presentation ever since the conference. I work with executives who are struggling with exactly the issues you addressed. Would you be interested in partnering with me to develop a workshop series for business leaders about surrendered leadership? The opportunity felt like another confirmation that God was expanding the reach of what He had taught me through my own struggles with control. Over the following weeks, David and I developed a workshop curriculum that combined practical business principles with the spiritual wisdom of surrender. What we're teaching isn't just stress management, David explained during one of our planning sessions. It's a fundamentally different approach to leadership that makes people more effective because they're not wasting energy on factors beyond their control. Our first workshop was held 6 weeks later for 20 senior executives from various industries. As I shared my story and taught the principles I'd learned, I watched faces around the room shift from skeptical curiosity to recognition and hope. The most powerful moment came when a pharmaceutical executive named Robert shared his own breakthrough during the session. I've been trying to control FDA approval timelines for our new drug applications, he said. I realize now that my job isn't to manage the regulatory process. It's to ensure we submit the highest quality applications possible and then trust the system to work as it's designed. Another participant, a retail chain CEO named Linda, had a similar realization. I've been exhausting myself trying to predict and control consumer behavior changes. But my actual responsibility is to create excellent products and responsive customer service, then adapt quickly to market feedback rather than trying to dictate market preferences. As the workshop series continued over the following months, I began to see a pattern. The most successful business leaders weren't those who tried to control every variable in their environment. They were those who excelled in their areas of responsibility while remaining flexible and responsive to factors beyond their control. But the most profound change wasn't in the workshop participants. It was in my own understanding of how God had prepared me for this unexpected ministry. The years of struggling with control issues, the exhaustion of trying to manage every outcome, the desperate night when he spoke to me about surrender, all of it had been preparation for helping other leaders discover the same freedom and effectiveness I had found. One evening, as I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed over the past 6 months, I called my father to share about the workshop ministry that was developing. "Dad, something remarkable is happening. The control issues that used to make me miserable are now helping me serve other people who struggle with the same problems. God is using my greatest weakness as a tool for ministry." My father was quiet for a moment, then said something that moved me deeply. "Son, that's exactly how God works. He doesn't waste our struggles, he redeems them. Your pain with control is becoming other people's pathway to peace." His words helped me understand that my journey with surrender wasn't just about my personal transformation. It was about discovering principles that could help anyone who was exhausting themselves trying to control outcomes beyond their influence. That weekend, I received an email from Maria, the startup founder I had met at the conference. "Andrew, I wanted to update you on how the surrender principles are working in my company. Our team is more collaborative, our investor relationships are healthier, and ironically, we're achieving better results because I'm not trying to control every outcome. Thank you for showing me that leadership effectiveness comes from excellence in what we can control, not anxiety about what we can't." As I read her message, I marveled at how God's promise had proven true in dimensions I never could have imagined. He really did take care of everything. Not just my personal circumstances, but the ripple effects of surrender that were touching other people's lives and leadership. The workshop series was expanding to other cities. More business leaders were requesting guidance about surrendered leadership, and I was discovering that my greatest professional fulfillment came not from controlling outcomes, but from faithfully serving others with what God had taught me. "God," I prayed that night, "thank you for showing me that you really do take care of everything, including using my struggles to serve others. Help me continue growing in surrender while remaining faithful to share these principles with whoever needs to hear them." Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach and practice surrender, and I was genuinely excited to see how God would continue using my journey with control to help other leaders discover the peace and effectiveness that come from working diligently while trusting Him with results beyond their influence. 1 year after God spoke those life-changing words to my exhausted heart, I found myself standing in the lobby of the newly opened Center for Surrendered Leadership, a facility dedicated to teaching business professionals how to lead effectively while trusting outcomes beyond their control. As executives, entrepreneurs, and consultants moved through the space, participating in workshops, attending support groups, and learning to distinguish between responsibility and control, I was overwhelmed with gratitude for how God had transformed my greatest struggle into a calling that was touching lives across multiple industries. The center was the culmination of 12 months of extraordinary growth and partnership with David Chen and a team of business consultants who had discovered the power of surrender-based leadership. What had started as a desperate prayer in my kitchen had become a movement that was changing how leaders approached uncertainty, stress, and effectiveness in their professional lives. David stood beside me, reviewing the day's workshop schedule as we prepared for the center's official opening ceremony. "Andrew, Do you remember that conference presentation where you first shared your story about control and surrender? If someone had told us then that it would lead to a national center helping business leaders find peace and effectiveness, I would have thought they were dreaming. I laughed, remembering how terrifying that first speaking opportunity had felt. The most amazing thing is that I still struggle with control issues sometimes, but now, instead of feeling ashamed of that struggle, I understand that it connects me to the people we're serving. My ongoing journey with surrender is what makes me effective at helping others with theirs. As if to prove my point, my mind was actively generating thoughts, even in this moment of celebration. What if the center doesn't meet expectations? What if we can't help as many leaders as we hope? What if the financial model isn't sustainable? What if I'm not qualified to lead an organization like this? But alongside these familiar concerns, I heard the steady voice of God's promise. Andrew, you try to control, but only I take care of everything. Udi. The difference was that now I could acknowledge the anxious thoughts without being controlled by them, could care deeply about the center's success without exhausting myself trying to guarantee specific outcomes. The opening ceremony began with remarks from Richard, my mentor, who had become not just a supporter but a board member of the center. As he spoke about the vision for surrendered leadership and the unique approach we were taking to business effectiveness, I found myself marveling at how God had orchestrated every connection and opportunity. Today represents a new chapter in how we understand business leadership, Richard said to the gathered crowd of executives, consultants, and community leaders. This center exists because one consultant was brave enough to admit that trying to control everything was making him less effective, not more, and wise enough to share that discovery with others. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium with the familiar mixture of nervous energy and peaceful confidence that had become my normal state when addressing audiences of business leaders. 1 year ago, I began, I was sitting on my kitchen floor at midnight, surrounded by contingency plans and spreadsheets, exhausted from trying to control every outcome in my business and personal life. In that moment of desperate prayer, God spoke to my heart with words that changed everything. Andrew, you try to control, but only I take care of everything. And I shared the complete journey, the initial breakthrough, the challenges of learning to distinguish between responsibility and control, the discovery that surrender actually enhanced rather than undermined professional effectiveness, and the gradual unfolding of a calling to help other leaders find the same freedom. This center exists not because I conquered the need to control, but because I learned to surrender it to God's care, I continued. Every program here, from our workshops on surrendered leadership to our support groups for executives struggling with control-based anxiety, came from understanding what it means to work diligently while trusting outcomes beyond our influence. The audience response was deeply moving. After my presentation, business leader after business leader approached to share their own struggles with control, their gratitude for resources that addressed both effectiveness and peace, and their hope that this approach would spread to other organizations. But the most meaningful interaction came from a young entrepreneur named Kevin, who reminded me of myself a year earlier. Mr. Anderson, I started my company 2 years ago, and I'm already burned out from trying to manage every variable. My team thinks I don't trust them because I try to control every decision. My investors are concerned because I seem anxious about factors beyond anyone's control. Can surrender really help me become a better leader? I looked at this young man who was carrying the same burden I had carried for so many years, and I felt God's compassion flowing through me. Kevin, what if I told you that your team would trust you more if you focused on empowering them rather than controlling them? What if your investors would have more confidence if you demonstrated wisdom about what you can and can't influence? We talked for 30 minutes about specific ways he could apply surrender principles to his leadership challenges. delegating with clear expectations rather than micromanaging, making decisions based on available information rather than trying to guarantee outcomes, and communicating with stakeholders about his vision and commitment rather than making promises about results beyond his control. "I never thought about leadership this way," Kevin said, as our conversation concluded. "I thought being responsible meant trying to control everything, but you're showing me that real responsibility means being excellent in what I can influence while trusting God with what I can't." That evening, as I walked through the center's various program spaces, the workshop rooms where executives were learning to lead with peace, the support group areas where business leaders were sharing their struggles with control, the quiet spaces where people could reflect and pray about their leadership challenges, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The principles of surrender hadn't just changed my personal stress levels, they had transformed my understanding of effectiveness, relationships, and purpose. I was serving more clients than ever before, but with less anxiety about outcomes. I was earning more money while worrying less about financial security. I was helping more people while being less attached to their responses to my guidance. My father, now thriving in his enhanced care facility, had become one of my greatest encouragers in this work. "Son, watching you learn to surrender control has been one of the greatest gifts of my old age," he had told me recently. "You're showing people that strength isn't about managing everything yourself. It's about knowing what belongs to you and what belongs to God." Well, really, my relationship with Sarah had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to honoring her father's memory. The startup that had faced acquisition challenges was now thriving under new ownership, with their leadership citing the operational foundation we had built as a key factor in their success. The manufacturing company had expanded my recommendations to all their facilities, seeing sustained improvements in both efficiency and employee satisfaction. But most significantly, I had discovered that God's promise to take care of everything wasn't just about managing my circumstances. It was about using my surrender journey to help others find the same peace and effectiveness I had discovered. As I prepared to leave the center that night, I encountered Maria, the startup founder I had met at that first conference presentation. She was attending one of our advanced workshops on surrendered leadership, continuing to grow in her understanding of how to lead effectively without trying to control every outcome. "Andrew, I had to come tonight to thank you," Maria said. "The past year of applying surrender principles to my leadership has transformed not just my stress levels, but my company's culture and performance. My team is more innovative because they're not afraid of making mistakes. My investors have more confidence because I communicate clearly about what we can and can't guarantee. And I'm more effective because I'm not exhausting myself trying to control variables beyond my influence." Her words captured the essence of what I had learned over this transformative year. Surrender wasn't about becoming passive or irresponsible. It was about discovering a completely different way of engaging with challenges that was both more peaceful and more effective than trying to control everything. Driving home that night, I marveled at the faithfulness of God's promise. The words he had spoken to me that desperate night, "You try to control, but only I take care of everything," had proven true in dimensions I never could have imagined. My mind was indeed still active, still generating concerns and possibilities and scenarios to consider, but I had learned to work with this mental energy rather than being overwhelmed by it, to channel it through God's wisdom toward productive purposes, to use it as raw material for serving others rather than a source of personal torment. As I pulled into my driveway, I whispered one final prayer of gratitude. "God, you said you would take care of everything, and you have been faithful beyond anything I could have imagined. Thank you for not taking away my need to plan and work hard, but for teaching me to do both while trusting you with results beyond my control. Use this center, these principles, and my ongoing journey to help other leaders find the same peace and effectiveness you've given me." The thoughts were still there as I prepared for bed. Excitement about the center's potential impact, concerns about maintaining quality programs as we grew, anticipation for the leaders we would serve in the coming months. But they felt like collaborative thoughts now, like God and I were working together to see how my experience with control could continue bringing peace and effectiveness to others. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice surrender while leading others. New chances to demonstrate that working diligently and trusting God with outcomes wasn't just possible, but was the most effective way to lead and live. The need to control may never completely disappear, but God's promise remains constant and reliable. He really does take care of everything we cannot control ourselves. And in that truth lies perfect peace, extraordinary effectiveness, and the freedom to work and love and serve from a place of trust rather than anxiety. We can do our part faithfully, knowing that God will handle everything else perfectly.